All right, folks. Man. So annoying. Yo, can you hear me in the chat? If you can, write yes. I moved room. Hopefully this stupid thing does not keep crashing out. If you can hear me, just let me know. Okay, sick. Cab Calloway, can you hear me as well? Yo, anyone here right now? Hello? Okay. I see you're still here. Thanks, bro. Yo, I'm just waiting for the other guy. I think he's gonna come back now. Should be. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me? That's true, you do. You do remain loyal, yeah. Oh, man. Bro, he went offline. Anyways, how are you doing, man? Hopefully he comes back soon. World Builders, maybe you can call him or something. Yeah, I mean, I can start with just you, but I don't really want to. At that point, it's just a call. You know? I know it's a little late to start, but I had to eat dinner and I'm really hoping someone here. But I'll ping everyone. Maybe that will help out. Okay. Hello. Welcome, Mr. Jacob Guy. I don't think I've ever seen this guy here before. But welcome nonetheless. We'll be starting shortly. I'm just trying to get some folks to join. Maybe he's typing right now. I don't know. Oh, man. Life's tough as a YouTuber, even after nearly 3K subs. It's so hard getting people to come live. Alright, folks. This Jacob Guy here is still here. We will start right away. Just want to make sure at least 2 people are here, essentially. So I'm assuming he's still here. Then yeah, it is more. He might have just came briefly. I don't know. This is a terrible stream in terms of numbers. Alright, if no one shows up in 2 minutes, I guess I'm just gonna have to start. So. Well, I don't know who this Jacob Guy was, but thanks for coming. I hope you're still here. We will start in a minute. You can DM from a fake African orphanage. An Orthodox Christians. Of course this happens to you, man. I can't see this happening to anyone else. Come on, we need someone else, please. Please join. Anyone? Let's just Discord one more time, and then I'm shutting it off. Bruh. No one's here. Get an Orthodox Kyle to join this Orthodox server, you're saying? How do you even know him? Have you like messaged this guy or something, or commented on his channel? See this guy. Ooh. I'm really just trying to see his channel though. Go to channel. Yeah, I've never seen this guy then. I don't know, guys. It's like, because there's also like a party-ish going on right now that I could be at. And I chose to not go for the stream, and now no one's here. The reason I didn't necessarily choose to go to the party right now is because it's like a campfire thing, but it's like It's still light outside. You're inviting a Russian. Yo, like, literally anyone who can join, just get them to join, please. Try Nioski too if he's up. Oh, he's not online, eh? Oh my gosh. It really is wild. It's like you have like 60 people in your server, have almost 3,000 subs, and you try to do one stream and no one cares. Can you call Seamus? Try doing that. Maybe he'll pick up. I don't know. I mean, Uncle Sam's asleep. I know that. Nioski's gone. Drumstick and No Shells never seemed that interested in the idea. Trying to think of anyone else. I'm glad you care. That's nice. It's better than nothing. I don't know, man. It's just that this is my issue with YouTube overall. Is like, you just get no views in general, no comments, and especially no subs. I'm getting no subs. Like, it's so demoralizing even trying to do this anymore. Like, I'm just gonna keep it real. Like, this might actually be like my last content on YouTube at this point, if like this is how bad it is. Man. Wait, can he not just listen to my stream with headphones on? Hopefully he's on Discord. Let me message this man. Okay. Why am I even still in this, bro? Oh, let's go. Welcome, sir. All right, we're finally gonna get started now. All right, welcome, gentlemen. Obviously, you know the drill. I'm not gonna explain it again because there's only two of you and you've both been to my streams a couple of times. As you know, we went over the Reformation last time. So today it's early modern Christianity. So we're gonna start off with the exciting 30 Years' War and then see where we go from there. But first, a little bit about the early Spanish Empire. So some of you probably know who this is, I imagine. In case you don't know, this is Ferdinand II of Aragon. And of course, during this entire time and pretty much most of the series, we have been focused on Europe. But the 16th century also saw the massive spread of Christianity across the world, mainly through colonialism. So in 1512, this man over here, who basically ruled Spain, enacted the laws of Burgos, which would govern the behavior of Spaniards in the Americas, especially towards the native population. Now, it actually banned the Spanish from enslaving the natives and instead encouraged their conversion to Catholicism, but unfortunately, these laws, as you can imagine, were barely enforced. Now, by 1516, most of the Caribbean was under Spanish control, and they would soon move on to the mainland to expand their empire. So between 1519 and 1522, the famous conquistador Hernán Cortés began his conquest of the Aztec Triple Alliance, and in the process did not just impose Spanish rule, but also Catholicism in the region, introducing Christianity to Mexico for the first time. Of course, not long after the conquerors came the missionaries, and in 1524, the so-called 12 Apostles of Mexico, a group of Franciscan missionaries, arrived in what was now called New Spain to convert the natives. They worked hard at their mission and provided them with schools and hospitals. But an important question soon arose. Were native people even humans, and therefore worthy of baptism? Now, you might think this is a stupid question, and, well, it is. But this is what the debates in 16th century New Spain looked like. Now, Pope Paul III weighed in his 1537 bull Sublimis Deus, which confirmed that yes, native people are actually humans, and after this shocking and mind-blowing fact, many more of them then started to convert to Catholicism from their previous pagan faith. Now, one particular group was known as the School of Salamanca, and they were big on the whole rights for native people. Now, they thought it was wrong to conquer other peoples for religious reasons or to force conversions, because it's what a certain other religion that we won't name does. Now, given everything we learned so far, this was quite a radical idea, but it's actually pretty popular among the Dominicans. But it did recognize legitimate reasons for conquest, such as the refusal of free trade or safe passage for Europeans, forcing Christians to convert to other religions, or refusing requests for a Christian government if Christians formed a large part of the population. Now, however, most European theologians at the time, as you can expect, did celebrate the conquest of the Native Americans because they saw it as a civilizing mission where they brought Christianity. And this is Pope Paul III, who, despite his many problems, he did actually acknowledge the humanity of the Native Americans, which shouldn't be a big deal, but it is. Now, in 1523, the Spanish were not just done with Mexico, and they began their conquest of most of Central America. And by 1525, they also began their conquest of Colombia and were slowly moving south along the Pacific coast of South America. In 1532, they had consolidated most of Central and Southern Mexico, as well as Central America, and the famous conquest of the Inca Empire began, which was mostly completed by 1535. And that was also when the Spanish began settling in Argentina too. Now, one of the big things that happened during this time was that in 1531, Mary is said to have appeared to Juan Diego, a local Aztec man, and the news spread quickly across Mexico. And this appearance caused a mass conversion of 8 million native Mexicans to Catholicism within just the span of 7 years. And while I am not a Catholic myself, I think this is a major improvement over their barbaric religion of sacrificing people every single morning so that the sun would rise. So, big improvement. And this is the very famous Virgin of Guadalupe, one of the most famous Marian apparitions and a very important symbol in Mexican history. Now, in 1549, Francis Xavier, a Jesuit missionary, then introduced Christianity to Japan, which soon led to many Japanese converting to Catholicism as well. 1565, the Spanish began their conquest of the Philippines and of Florida, and they spread Catholicism to Southeast Asia and the mainland US. 1582 saw Matteo Ricci, an Italian Jesuit priest, begin his missionary work in China, and he introduced Western science, math, astronomy, and art. The Jesuits soon became some of the emperor's most trusted advisors, and many Confucian priests actually converted to Catholicism. Now, the Catholics even began conversion efforts in Ethiopia, which was Oriental Orthodox, and even converted Emperor Susenyos I in 1622, who actually made Catholicism the official religion of Ethiopia of all places in 1626. But this was too good to be true, and his son Fasilides expelled the Jesuits in 1633 and then burned their books 2 years later, and that is why Ethiopia is not a Catholic country today. Now, in 1600, meanwhile, Protestantism reached the Americas when English Calvinists began their colonization of St. Lucia. Now, up until then, and basically, so this was during the late 15th and early 16th, and the 16th century, colonization was a game that was only being played by the Spanish and the Portuguese. But then, of course, our favorite duo, the French and the English, entered the scene. And as you very well know, they would not exit for a very long time. In 1605, the French began colonizing Acadia in modern-day Nova Scotia, and in 1608, they created Quebec City, to the detriment of all of us Canadians ever since. No hate to the French Canadians, by the way, that's a joke. Meanwhile, in 1607, the English founded the settlement of Jamestown, the first English colony in the US, and unfortunately we've had to deal with that country too. Anyways, putting my biases aside, in 1616, the Dutch began their colonization of Guyana, and that spread Calvinism to South America. But soon, a much more famous group of Calvinists would land in North America. It's, of course, these guys. Of course, how could you not know who they are, with their famous funny hats and their strict lifestyle, or, of course, talking about the Puritans. But what did they actually believe? Well, they had wanted to reform the Church of England into a reformed church and were against what they saw as idolatrous ornaments and rituals, such as ornaments, kneeling in church, priests wearing special clothes, and organs, all of which they associated with the Pope. Now, they refused to adopt all the rituals and doctrines of the Book of Common Prayer and its imposition of a liturgical order. The Puritans then became known as nonconformists, although this term soon began applying to basically all denominations that did not come out of the Reformation. And those ones were the Hussites, the ones that did come out of the Reformation, by the way. Those are the Hussites, the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Anabaptists, and the Anglicans. Now, these Puritan funny bunch landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and established the colony of New England, which became a place of spiritual and economic freedom and a refuge for Protestants fleeing for peace, opportunity, and freedom. Now, 4 years later, more Calvinists would settle in the Americas when the Dutch founded New Netherland, with its capital in New Amsterdam, now known as New York. They also took some Portuguese land in Brazil, founding Dutch Brazil, although this did not last very long. Now, in 1638, even the Swedes were trying their hand at this whole colonization thing, and they founded New Sweden, now in Delaware and New Jersey, and therefore they spread Lutheranism to the Americas. And then finally, in 1647, Russia reached the Pacific Ocean, and Christianity was clearly becoming a global force, but one that was more divided than it had ever been. So then we have the question, would there be religious peace now as the Reformation was sort of going down? Now, after Elizabeth I died in England, she was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603. Now, he fiercely denounced the Pope's authority to depose monarchs, but is most known for a little Bible translation he created in 1611, which is named after him. You may have heard about it, the King James Bible. Well, that's him. Now, he wanted to bring religious peace, and under him, the final execution for heresy occurred in 1612, when Edward Whiteman, who of course was an Anabaptist, because they always get the short end of the stick, was burned alive. Now, similarly to James, Henry IV of France, who had been a Protestant, wanted to heal the religious divide, and for a time this seemed to work. Even the Dutch and the Spanish, bitter enemies at war for 41 years, agreed to a several-year-long truce in 1609. But if you think peace would last, well, Henry was shot by a Catholic radical. Maybe this was the Charlie Kirk thing of his day, I don't know. And let's just say the religious conflict was coming back. Now, 1610, of course, was the year that Galileo Galilei published Sidereus Nuncius, where he described the observations he made with his telescope. His controversial takes on astronomy, philosophy, and ultimately theology got him into trouble with the Catholic Church, and he was sentenced in 1633 on suspicion of heresy. But the 17th century would be mostly defined in Europe by the 30 Years' War, the greatest religious war in the continent's history. And the conflict can be traced back to 1608, when the Holy Roman Empire's Protestants wanted to confirm the 1555 Peace of Augsburg. Now, if you remember from before, the Peace of Augsburg was basically the decision where all Holy Roman Empire monarchs could choose between Lutheranism or Catholicism. Now, Archduke Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, would agree to this on the condition that Catholic lands seized since then would be returned. But this caused issues because even though he was Catholic, he was supposed to be neutral. So that caused a little bit of a problem. So let's check in on the chat here. Oh, okay. I can't tell if the Pajee guy seems like too much of a troll, honestly. Hello, Alexander Ovechkin. Nice to see you here. Anyways, we'll continue. So, basically, all this tension caused Frederick IV, Elector Palatine, to form the Protestant Union that year, so Maximilian I, the Elector of Bavaria, responded the next year with his own Catholic union. Now, Emperor Matthias had no children, so in 1617 his relative Philip III of Spain agreed to support Ferdinand's claim to the throne. In exchange, Ferdinand would support Spain's ongoing war against the Dutch, but it wasn't guaranteed that he would become emperor. Although his family had been emperors since 1440, the Habsburgs had technically been elected each time. Now, you see, the thing is, basically, there were 4 Catholic electors and 3 Protestant electors. But this could change if a vote flipped and there would be a Protestant Holy Roman Emperor for the first time. Now, one of these electors was the King of Bohemia, and Ferdinand became king there in 1617. But this was despite the fact that most of its nobles and people were Protestant. And so, would we finally get a Protestant Holy Roman Emperor? Well, before we answer that question, let's look at a map of Europe in 1618, at the start of the 30 Years' War and basically 100 years after the Reformation. So we can see a lot of things. Now, first of all, Catholicism has spread massively globally. We can see most of the Philippines has become Catholic. Large parts of the coast of Brazil are now there. Pretty much the entire west coast of South America and large parts of Bolivia and Argentina are also Catholic. Pretty much all of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and also smaller parts here in, well, Quebec and Florida. And then we have the Eastern Orthodox, represented by the Russian Empire, who, again, represent most of the Orthodox population at this point, slowly but steadily moving east, and as well as retaining their homeland in the Balkans and the Caucasus. We have the Oriental Orthodox, still kind of just the same thing, chilling over here in Armenia and Ethiopia, but there are still small communities left around here. The Nestorians still holding out strong in this tiny area of Assyria. But Europe, as we can see, at least Western Central Europe, is very divided. So of course we have the Calvinists here in Switzerland, but also very large parts of France are Calvinist, as well as parts of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, etc. The Netherlands as well are also Calvinist, and of course we cannot forget Scotland and large parts of central England. Then we have the Lutherans, who are, holding out strong here in Scandinavia as well as northern Germany. And we also have some nonconformists now, so that includes here in Northern Ireland, scattered across England, etc. The Anglicans, mostly concentrated in southern and eastern England. You have very small remnants of the Hussites still in the Czech Republic. And that pretty much covers everything. So in this complicated mess, we are about to make things way messier. And so now we have to learn how a window started 30 years of war. So Ferdinand was what we could call a very hardcore Catholic, and he said he would rather destroy his territory than tolerate heresy. So he began persecuting Protestants. Now, although he tolerated them in Bohemia for now, nobody trusted he wouldn't soon switch. There were soon land disputes, all of which were conveniently won by Catholics. So in 1618, the Bohemian nobles, led by Gindrich Matthias Thurn, met in Prague Castle with 2 of Ferdinand's Catholic representatives and promptly yeeted them out of the castle's window. Now, both of the men survived. Now, what they would tell you is that Mary saved them, while the Protestant would say they landed in cow poop and that's how they managed to survive falling out of the window. And while it's up to you to choose which story you believe out of the two. Now, the defenestration of Prague then led Thurn to establish a Protestant government in Bohemia. Austria needed to crush this rebellion, but the problem is they were dependent on Spanish help. And so here are the 2 delegates being thrown out of the window. And here is Emperor Ferdinand, who, as we said, was a pretty hardcore Catholic. So, Thurn's Bohemian army soon advanced all the way to the imperial capital at Vienna, and Ferdinand was facing a bad spot. The conflict quickly escalated, and since the Spanish supported the Catholic Union, the Dutch began arming and supplying the Protestant Union. Things came to an end after the death of Emperor Matthias in 1619, and Ferdinand was chosen expected to succeed him but needed the Bohemians to vote in his favor. But as you can imagine, well, the Bohemians were not fans of him, and instead they chose their own emperor, Frederick V of the Palatinate, who was a Calvinist. Now, Maximilian I, the Elector of Bavaria, then funded an imperial Catholic army led by Johann Tserclaes, the Count of Tilly, to reconquer Austria and then march on Prague. He won the decisive Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, and Frederick V was forced to flee to his own country, and then his army disintegrated. And that is the Battle of White Mountain, where the Bohemian Revolt was crushed. So, although most Protestant princes had actually supported Ferdinand in the war because they believed that you couldn't just remove a ruler, I mean, after all, they didn't want that happening to them, Ferdinand proceeded to do just that when he allowed his ally, Maximilian of Bavaria, to take Frederick's land in the Palatinate. Now, the conflict only escalated when the Spanish got involved in the war, causing James I of England to respond by threatening to seize their colonies if they didn't withdraw by 1621. Now, the Spanish actually backed down in exchange for an alliance, and this kept England out of the war. However, throughout 1622, Spanish and imperial troops continued their occupation of Frederick V's territory, and at an imperial diet the next year, Emperor Ferdinand forced Frederick's land and his vote to be passed to Maximilian, securing 4 Catholic electors and only 3 Protestant ones. And here is Frederick V, the so-called Winter King, because he was only actually able to be King of Bohemia and sort of, I guess, pretender to the Holy Roman Empire for just one winter. And this is the Count of Tilly, I believe, although I need to double check that. Now, who's going to intervene? Well, the Danes will. So John George I, the Elector of Saxony, and George William, the Elector of Brandenburg, were now worried that Ferdinand wanted former Catholic land held by Protestants to be returned by force. And this caused Denmark to intervene on the Protestant side in 1625, and they soon received Dutch and French support. However, they faced the formidable Catholic commander Albrecht von Wallenstein, who had occupied much of the Protestant Northern Empire by 1627, and then he began constructing a fleet that would contest the Danish naval dominance in the Baltic Sea. In 1628, his army besieged Stralsund, which was the only port capable of constructing such a large navy. This freaked out the Danes' enemies, Sweden, and this brought about the intervention of their legendary king, Gustavus Adolphus. Now, his Swedish and Scottish troops successfully defended the city, although the Danes kept losing and agreed to peace with the 1629 Treaty of Lubeck. The Danes would agree to quit the war in exchange for keeping Schleswig and Holstein. Now, Wallenstein won, but he needed to pay his troops, and Ferdinand allowed them to confiscate land, extort ransoms from towns, and plunder land, whether it was Catholic or not. Now, Ferdinand seems to always manage to make himself even less popular, and he did just that when he deposed the Duke of Mecklenburg, and then he replaced him with his buddy Wallenstein. Now, overconfident from his military success, Ferdinand then finally passed the Edict of Restitution in 1629, which required all Catholic lands taken since 1555 to be returned. Now, this basically would mean that all land owned by Calvinists would have to be returned, and Catholic rule would also be returned to areas that had long since stopped following the Catholic Church. And so here we have the Lion of the North, Gustavus Adolphus. So the Spanish were not faring much better, and they began losing a lot of money while the Dutch West India Company made things worse by capturing their treasure fleet in 1628. By 1629, only a few Holy Roman states still openly opposed Emperor Ferdinand, and therefore Gustavus Adolphus seized this opportunity to help his fellow Protestants as well as increase his share in the Baltic Sea trade. Now, he landed in Pomerania in 1630 with 18,000 Swedish soldiers and forced Duke Bogislaw XIV to side with him. Now, although the Swedes found little success, Ferdinand somehow made himself even less popular after the infamous sack of Magdeburg in 1631, which caused many to fear that their city might be completely leveled to the ground as well. But to be fair, right, this is the same guy who said he'd rather destroy his entire territory than tolerate heresy. So, I mean, he was just doing what he said he would do. Now, although they were Catholic, the French were eager to decrease Spanish and Austrian power, and therefore they decided to betray their Catholic faith and fund the Swedes and Germans in order to have them get along. This led to the 1631 Treaty of Barwald, which funded these countries and increased Swedish income by a quarter. Now, Gustavus Adolphus used this money to win several major victories, but found himself killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. But fighting continued until dusk, and Wallenstein was forced to retreat. Now, Sweden's war effort was now led by Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, who with French help formed the Heilbronn League with his German allies in 1633. They then beat an imperial army at Oldendorf, and it began to be rumored that Commander Wallenstein was considering switching sides, which caused Ferdinand to assassinate his very own friend in 1634. And to be honest, like obviously I'm not pro Ferdinand, but my goodness, this guy was his biggest enemy. As in, he was his own biggest enemy. He kept managing to make everyone hate him. And here we have Gustavus Adolphus before he died. Rest in peace, legend. Anyways, moving on. So now we get France joining the war. Now with Wallenstein gone, Ferdinand was now forced to rely on Spain, who was mainly concerned with their still ongoing war with the Dutch because that was still not over. Cardinal Infante Ferdinand of Austria, who was ruling the Spanish Netherlands, raised an army which met with the imperial army, and then they won a major victory at Nordlingen in 1634. This forced Sweden to lose a lot of power, and realizing the Protestant faction was losing, the French decided to declare war on Spain in 1635, even though they were Catholic. Now, despite this, Ferdinand actually managed to negotiate with the Holy Roman Princes with the Peace of Prague and withdrew the Edict of Restitution in exchange for the League of Heilbronn and the Catholic League both agreeing to dissolve. From now on, there would be one imperial army, although Saxony and Bavaria would keep their own separate armies. And with this situation, France decided now was the time to join in, and they declared war on Ferdinand in 1636. Now, France invaded the Spanish Netherlands only for the Spanish to do a reverse Uno and invade northern France. The Spanish and Austrians, though, lost direct contact in 1639 after the French, maybe they jammed their WhatsApp signals or something, and then they attempted to control the sea, but that ended after the Dutch Navy under Martin Tromp won a significant victory against the Spanish at the Battle of the Downs. In 1640, the French invaded Spanish Artois, while the Dutch seized Portuguese colonies, and this led to Portugal and Catalonia rebelling against Spanish rule. Now, desperate to reverse the situation, the Spanish tried to invade northern France one more time in 1643, but this failed, and they finally had to realize that they would never reconquer the Netherlands, which is kind of funny. It only took them, 75 years at this point? Now, despite their victory, the French faced the problem of fighting in such devastated territory that their army spent more time looking for food than enemies, and this weakened them a lot. Now, Ferdinand II died in 1637 and was replaced by his son Ferdinand III, who finally began negotiations in Westphalia in 1643 with Sweden and France, but these were delayed by blockade because of the Danes. Now, this harmed the Dutch and Swedish economies, and this actually led to the Torstenson War, in which Sweden, which was Protestant, invaded Denmark, which was also Protestant. Now, Ferdinand tried to take advantage of the situation by attacking the Swedes, but this failed. Now, in 1644, Swedish General Lennart Torstensson marched into the empire while the Danes sued for peace. Now, realizing they were screwed, Maximilian of Bavaria began pressuring Emperor Ferdinand to make peace. Now, this only became more urgent after Imperial General Matthias Gallus's army crumbled that winter, and then the Swedish and French armies directly invaded Bavaria in 1646. Now, the Spanish made public a secret treaty that they'd made with the French to exchange French-controlled Catalonia for the Spanish Netherlands. Now, the Dutch got really angry about this, and they began negotiating separate peace with the Spanish. Now, the French were determined to take their land by force if necessary, and their army would be led by this guy, Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Viscount of Turenne. However, his mostly German army mutinied, and Bavaria also refused to keep its peace with France, which led to a second invasion by Sweden and France in 1648. Now, Sweden then advanced to capture Prague, the very place where the war had all started, although they literally only did this to steal just as much treasure as they possibly could. And after the Spanish failed again to invade France, negotiations for peace finally started. So the Peace of Westphalia was negotiated in 1648, in which Ferdinand was forced to accept that the Diet had more power than him, and that each state in the Holy Roman Empire could choose its own religion, which now also included Calvinism, so now you had 3 options. Ooh. And from now on, though, a ruler's subjects were free to choose their own faith, even if it was different from that of the ruler. After 80 years, the War of the Netherlands finally ended, with the Spanish finally accepting their independence, while the Austrians accepted Swiss independence from the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the hardcore Catholics and Protestants disliked the peace, since Pope Innocent X was angry that some bishoprics had been given to the Swedes and French, while Protestants were mad that Bohemia, which had started the entire war, was forced to come under Ferdinand's Catholic control. Now, I think we can all agree that the real losers here were definitely the Bohemians themselves. I mean, they tried to get independence, they failed and got taken over by the Austrians, and then the final Protestant army to enter, the Swedes literally only just came there to steal all their stuff and then leave. So they definitely had it the worst. And maybe this is why the Czechs are so atheist today. But nevertheless, they finally agreed to peace. And this is Pope Innocent X. Not very happy, as you can tell. So let's look at the effects of the 30 Years' War. The importance of the 30 Years' War is hard to underestimate. Around 6 million died. I mean, I wonder when the next time 6 million people will die in Germany. Mostly civilians, causing the Holy Roman Empire's population to decline significantly, and many refugees who survived later died of plague. Now, Westphalia led to the idea that every state was now sovereign and should no longer have its decisions made by external factors, which led to the idea of nation-states. This was also the last major religious war fought in Europe, because the devastation was so bad that many people began believing that religion wasn't even worth fighting over anymore. The war marked the end of the Reformation, and from now on, Europe's religious map would change little after this. And here is a picture of just an average day in the 30 Years' War, people getting hung, armies roaming the countryside. Not a fun time to be alive. So let's look at Christianity in 1648. Now, you'll see that basically nothing has actually changed in Europe, so I won't be going over that. Instead, we'll be looking more at the global situations. We can see now the Russians and the Orthodox, therefore, have reached all the way to the Pacific Ocean. More of the coast of South America has been colonized. We see the Dutch colonies over here in Guyana and in Brazil, as well as some over here in New Netherlands. Now, this area is also Calvinist, despite being English, because this is where the Puritans landed. The French Catholics have expanded a little more here in Canada, and then some nonconformist English have settled mainly in Virginia and Newfoundland, and then we can even see some Lutherans. That is the colony of New Sweden, which was, of course, run by the Lutheran Swedes. So let's check in on the chat. Okay. Who even are all these trolls, bro? It's like, I've never seen any of these people, and yeah. Anyways, whatever. I honestly believe like all these new people are not even in it to watch. But hey, at least you guys are giving me the views, so anyways, if this queer guy is not a total troll, yeah, I already talked about how King Henry suppressed the monasteries. But, I don't know. Anyways, let's keep going. So, now if you think that England was safe from all this religious warfare, you're actually mistaken. The Puritans played a large role in this violence, which would eventually escalate into the English Civil War in 1642. It was essentially a fight between the supporters of Charles I of England, who were mostly Anglicans and somewhat sympathetic to Catholicism, versus the supporters of the Parliament, who were mostly Calvinists. The wars led to the execution of Charles I and the transformation of England into a Calvinist republic under Oliver Cromwell. Although the Puritans tried to set up their own church, this failed, and in 1660, Charles I's son, Charles II, restored the monarchy as well as the Church of England. And this is old Chuck Boy getting his head chopped off. Now, the Eastern Orthodox, who I feel like are kind of trolling me right now in the chat, they met to dunk on the Protestants. So in 1671, Dositheos II, the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, convened a synod there which rejected all Calvinist doctrines and formulated Eastern Orthodox teachings in a way that distinguished them from both Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Now, the synod was attended by most major Eastern Orthodox representatives, and its decrees were universally accepted by the Eastern Orthodox Church. It reaffirmed the Eastern Orthodox belief that the Holy Spirit came only from the Father, confirmed that apostolic succession of bishops was necessary, that good works were needed for salvation, that there are 7 sacraments, and that communion is a sacrifice offered for the dead and the living. And so now we get to see Christianity in 1676. Again, not too much, but we can see Eastern Orthodoxy spreading with the Russian Empire. We see Calvinism now over here in Africa with the Dutch Cape Colony over here, as well as over here in the Molucca Islands. The Danes actually owned a fort over here, so that's why it's Lutheran. And then we can see the nonconformists sort of spreading here across the United States, as well as the Catholics in Canada. So, in 1652, Protestantism began to replace Catholicism as the dominant form of Western Christianity in Africa, as the Swedes established a colony on the Gold Coast in modern southeast Ghana, while the Dutch established the Cape Colony at the southern tip of the continent. Now, the Swedes' brief experiment with colonization ended soon when the Dutch conquered New Sweden in 1655, and the Danes conquered the Swedish Gold Coast in 1558. Now, in 1670, the English and French started expanding their colonies. The English founded South Carolina and the Hudson Bay Company, while the French began their colonization of the U.S. by expanding from the Great Lakes. But in 1685, King Louis XIV of France enacted the Edict of Fontainebleau, which ended tolerance for Huguenots, forcing most to flee to France or convert to Catholicism. And this would be the last major religious change in Europe for quite a while. Now, Pietism is a movement that started with a German theologian named Philip Spener, who was convinced of the need for a moral and religious reformation within the German Lutheran Church. He spent a year in Geneva and was impressed by the strict moral life and church discipline there. In 1666, he then became a pastor in Frankfurt with a conviction that too much emphasis was placed on good theology and not enough on actually being a good person. So he began hosting meetings at his house where he preached sermons, explained Bible passages, and encouraged his audience to have conversations on religious issues. In 1675, he then published a book that would lead his followers to become known as Pietists. It made a very large influence in Germany, and while many Lutheran pastors and theologians were offended by his book, others adopted it. So this is Philip Spener over here. And in Leipzig, he created a society of theologians for the study and application of the Bible, some of which would found the University of Halle in 1694. And at this university, Spener's teaching on the importance of a new birth and separation from the world were spread, and they condemned dancing, theater, and public games. Now, he died in 1705, but his movement spread throughout Germany, and one University of Halle student named Nikolaus Zinzendorf actually managed to revive the Moravian Church, which you remember is the Hussite Church, in 1727. He also began the first major Protestant missionary movement, and Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg was the first Pietist missionary to India. And now we finally move on to Christianity during the Enlightenment. So one of the results of the constant wars of religion was the rise of the Age of Enlightenment, which resulted in theologians who wanted to limit the church's political power in order to prevent another age of intolerant religious war. Now, these thinkers want to reform Christianity to what they believed were its non-confrontational roots and to limit religious involvement in the state. The Enlightenment is often said to have started with the 1637 publication of René Descartes' Discourse on the Method, where he disbelieved everything unless there was a good reason for it. Now, certain Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke wanted to rely on the Bible alone, without theology, and determined that Christianity was centered around the belief in Christ the Redeemer, and really nothing more. So let's look a little bit more at John Locke over here. So his essay concerning human understanding is often considered the birth of deism, which is a theological position that rejects revelation as a source of divine knowledge, and basically says that the only thing that you can know about God's existence can be seen through reason and observation. He also played a major role in the development of the Radical Enlightenment, where he promoted the idea of separating the church and the state, and he believed that the government had no right to determine an individual's conscience. Therefore, people had the right to freedom of conscience, which had to be protected from government authorities. These views on religious tolerance, individual conscience, and the social contract would majorly influence the drafting of the American Constitution. And so now we have Christianity in 1700 over here. So again, not too much to say as compared to our previous map, but again, we can see, Catholicism is now quite consolidated within Quebec. There are now some nonconformists. These are Englishmen who settled over here in the Hudson Bay area. And Catholicism has been spreading a little more into the southern United States, deeper into Brazil. And we can see now that the Protestant community in France is basically gone. So, the Catholic missionaries to China faced a problem known as the Chinese rites controversy over whether Chinese Confucian practices of venerating their ancestors were a form of idolatry or not. So, while the Jesuits saw them as mere cultural traditions, the Franciscans and the Dominicans did not, and they actually reported them back to the Vatican. This eventually led the Kangxi Emperor in 1721 to just ban all Christian missionaries because he refused to allow anyone to change this practice. Now, in 1742, Pope Benedict XIV issued a bull that stressed the purity of Christian traditions and teachings against all heresies, and banned missionaries from partaking in ceremonies honoring Confucius or the emperors. And this basically ended all the progress that had been made in converting the Chinese upper class to Catholicism. Now, meanwhile, the Orthodox were having their own little thingy, and a different controversy was brewing, which pitted the Christian Serbs against the Muslim Ottomans. Now, this started during the Great Turkish War from 1683 until 1699, in which the Ottomans fought against the Austrians. Now, the Serbian Patriarch Arsenie III Crnojevic sided with the Austrians in 1696, and Arsenie IV Jovanovic Sakabenta sided with them in 1737 in a different war. And so to punish them, the Ottoman armies conducted many atrocities against the Serbian population, resulting in the Great Migration of Serbs, mainly to Austrian territory. Now, more Serbian rebellions and the involvement of their patriarchs in these anti-Ottoman activities led them to favor more reliable Greek bishops. This soon led to fights between the Greeks and the Serbs over who was the rightful Patriarch of Pec, which was then dissolved in 1766 by Ottoman Sultan Mustafa III. So again, now skipping forward to 1732, map looks pretty similar, especially in Europe, but we can see now nearly all of South America has been converted to Catholicism, with sort of just the interior and Patagonia remaining unconverted. We can see the French have spread Catholicism all throughout the area of the Mississippi River, whereas nonconformist Protestantism has become pretty standard across the English colonies, with the exception of New England, which has remained Calvinist. So, as seen from earlier, the Pietists emphasized personal faith over rigidly intellectual Protestant scholasticism, and they cared less about traditional doctrinal divisions between Protestants, and they focused more on religious experiences. Now, although Zinzendorf's Herrnhut community was initially just for members of the Moravian Church, it soon experienced a revival, and soon Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists began flocking there. These ideas would soon spread beyond Germany to England, where two Anglican priests, the brothers John and Charles Wesley, would become leaders of what became known as the Evangelical Revival. They were members of a religious society at the University of Oxford that was known at the time as the Holy Club. So, in 1733, George Whitefield would join the Holy Club and read the work of Calvinist Scottish theologian Henry Scougal, which was called The Life of God and the Soul of Man. This book enlightened Whitefield, who said he never knew what true religion was until he read it, and he experienced what he called a new birth. So he had a conversion experience during Lent in 1735, and the next year began preaching in England. He brought in large crowds who were attracted to a simple message of the importance of being born again. He was a dramatic preacher and would sometimes impersonate Bible characters or cry. In 1735, John Wesley, meanwhile, left for the colony of Georgia to become a missionary for the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and met members of the Moravian Church, who were impressed by their faith and piety, but especially by their belief that you could actually know whether you're saved. So this is John Whitefield and John Wesley, this is John Wesley, Charles Wesley, and George Whitefield over here. So John Wesley then basically began questioning his faith, and then he went back to London, where he met with Moravian minister Peter Bowler and joined a Moravian small group called the Fetter Lane Society. In 1738, he then experienced a spiritual transformation while at a Moravian meeting where Luther's preface to the Book of Romans was being read. He then traveled to Herrnhut to meet with Nicholas Zinzendorf. He then began preaching in London churches with his brother and was soon joined by George Whitefield. However, Whitefield's preaching across the country was controversial, and many churches refused to let him preach. And these new Methodists, as they were coming to be known as, came into conflict with the dominant Anglican society and churches. Now, in 1739, when Anglican priests banned Whitefield from preaching in their churches, he began just preaching out in the open, which was already common in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but not in England. But, I mean, this guy was popular. He was bringing in crowds of 10,000 people, and soon 50,000 people were attending his sermons in London. He also began using ads in newspapers to promote his revivals, which made him even more controversial. Now, the Methodist preachers began focusing particularly on preaching to those who'd been neglected by the Church of England, and these new converts were organized into Methodist societies. They would go to classes where people were encouraged to confess their sins to each other and share testimony. And by the time of John Wesley's death in 1791, there were about 71,000 Methodists in England and 43,000 in the US. Now, speaking of the US, what was going on there? Well, it still consisted of 13 British colonies, which were very religiously diverse. In New England, congregational churches, a branch of Calvinism derived from the Puritans, was the state religion. In the Middle colonies, the Quaker, Dutch Reformed, Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Congregational, and Baptist churches all competed for influence. And in the southern colonies, the Anglican Church was the official one, but there were also some Baptist, Quakers, and Presbyterians. But church membership was low because there weren't enough churches for the many people who kept immigrating and being born, and the alignment was also causing many to move away from Christianity to deism, Unitarianism, Universalism, and even atheism. So in this environment, the ministers influenced by New England Puritanism, Northern Irish Presbyterianism, and European Pietism began calling for a revival, and these branches would converge into what is now known as evangelicalism. Now, they emphasized the importance of revivals, outpourings of the Holy Spirit, experiencing God's love personally, and personal conversion. And they began revivals throughout the early 18th century, and one of these was led by New Jersey Presbyterian pastor Gilbert Tennent. Now, he met Dutch Reformed pastor Theodorus Jacobus Vellinghuizen, who believed in the importance of living a holy life and personal conversion. And Tennent was influenced by him and believed that a conversion experience followed by assurance of salvation was what made someone a Christian. Now, the first major American revival would happen in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1734, under the leadership of Congregational minister Jonathan Edwards. That fall, he began preaching a series of sermons on justification by faith alone, and this led to a large increase in religious commitment, especially among the young, and the revival soon spread to 25 communities. Now, to him, there was a single moment in which God saved people, even if we do not know exactly when. Now, his services started becoming more emotional, and some people had visions and mystical experiences, which obviously caused some controversy, but Edwards basically defended these experiences as long as they brought glory to God. He then wrote a book about his experience called A Faithful Narrative in 1737, which was published in England and led to the growth of evangelicalism over there as well. And this would be what led to the First Great Awakening. So anyways, let's see what's going on here. Is this You Want This? I feel like these guys are all trolls, bro. Like, none of these guys seem serious to me. I mean, like, yeah, it's nice. How many people? 5, 6 people, but like, he's like, Turks treat us better than you Prots. The Orthodox? The Protestants have done nothing to the Orthodox. I'm not even sure what this guy's yapping about. The thing is, this guy's just making it up. Anyway, let's keep going. So in this context of revival, George Whitefield returned to America in 1739, where he first preached at Christ Church, Philadelphia, its main Anglican church. He then began preaching in many Presbyterian churches and traveled to New York and then the southern colonies. Now in 1742, he began his tour of New England, and he went to Jonathan Edwards' Northampton Church, where Edwards was so moved that he actually cried. Whitefield then met Gilbert Tennent in New York City and asked him to preach revival in New England, and this produced large crowds and many conversions. Now, Tennent and Whitefield would be followed by other itinerant preachers, but most of the revival was carried out by local preachers. This led to what was called the First Great Awakening from 1740 to 1743, which placed very big emphasis on prayer and devotional reading of the Bible. About 20,000 to 50,000 people then joined the congregational churches, and this is kind of the beginning of the whole evangelical movement really in the world. And here we have George Whitefield preaching in America. Now, the First Great Awakening caused a lot of controversy, with those who supported it called New Light and those who opposed it called Old Light. The Old Light saw itinerant preaching as disruptive and preferred formal worship and a settled, university-educated ministry. They saw the New Light as being ignorant or con artists, while the New Light accused them of caring more about social status instead of salvation. So some of these formed a group known as strict Congregationalists, who split off from the other Congregationalist churches and required evidence of conversion for church membership. They were soon persecuted and not given the same religious tolerance as other Christian denominations. Now, in the Presbyterian Church, this became known as the Old versus New Side debate, with the Old Side kicking out the New Side at the 1741 Synod of Philadelphia. Now, interestingly enough, those who benefited the most from the First Great Awakening were the Baptists of all people, who experienced a lot of growth throughout the end of the 18th century. And this mainly came from the New Light Congregationalists, who became convinced of believers' baptism, and sometimes entire separatist congregational churches just converted to being Baptists instead. And ironically enough, the First Great Awakening made sectarianism, or in other words, the constant division in Christianity, a normal part of American Christianity, but it also encouraged interdenominational unity at the same time. Evangelicals felt a common bond with each other, whether they were Anglican, Presbyterian, or Congregational. Now, this event also led to the founding of new educational institutes such as Princeton University in 1746 by New Side Presbyterians, and other universities like Yale, which had once resisted evangelicalism, later on played a leading role in it. And here is another painting of the sermons that were being preached at during the First Great Awakening. I believe this is maybe, I can't tell, maybe it's Whitefield or could be Jonathan Edwards. I don't know. Anyways, let's look at these southern colonies. Now, Northern Methodist and Baptist preachers converted both white and black people, which caused a lot of white Christians to start welcoming black Christians into their church, allowing them to play an active role as exhorters, deacons, and even sometimes as preachers. Now, the message of spiritual equality appealed to many slaves, and this caused many of them to embrace Christianity for the first time and abandon African paganism. Many evangelical leaders also encouraged slave owners to let their slaves learn how to read so that they could study the Bible. Now, George Whitefield criticized slave owners who abused and refused to educate their slaves, but he was not in favor of abolishing slavery and became a slave owner himself. He instead believed that the slaves would be equal just in heaven. Now, one evangelical preacher who made a major impact on the slaves was Samuel Davies, a Presbyterian minister and later president of Princeton University, and his preaching caused very high numbers of slaves to convert to Christianity in Virginia. He also believed that black people could gain equal knowledge to white people if they were allowed to be educated, and therefore he encouraged slave owners to allow this. Now, the emotional worship of evangelical revivals appealed to many black Americans, and they started to emerge from the revivals in large numbers after they converted. This allowed the creation of the first black churches in the colonies, and especially the first black Baptist churches. Now, in the wake of the Enlightenment and the Pietist movements, questioning religious authority became more common, and rationalism became seen as a better approach to interpreting the Bible. And philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza began questioning whether Moses actually wrote all 5 books of the Pentateuch. Jean Astruc, a French professor of medicine, started a system called biblical criticism, in which he used textual criticism to examine the Bible. Meanwhile, in 1750, Johann David Michaelis, a German biblical scholar and teacher at the University of Halle, wrote the first critical introduction to the New Testament, and this led other German Protestant theologians born in the 1750s to interpret the Bible as a myth. So in 1768, this guy, German Enlightenment philosopher and deist Hermann Samuel Reimarus, died. Now, he had many controversial views, such as denying the supernatural origin of Christianity and claiming that Jesus was just a prophet whose apostles founded a separate religion. And I'm sure we haven't heard that one being said anytime recently. Now, he was therefore the first person to refer to a historical Jesus distinct from the real Jesus, and in his mind, Jesus was a failed political messiah who tried to rebel against the Romans but was executed. His disciples then stole his body and claimed that he was still alive to profit from the story. Now, meanwhile, if we go back to the Catholic Church, the Jesuits were continuing to get ragged on from the Catholic establishment, and their support of Native Americans in South America fueled growing criticism, especially from the Spanish and Portuguese governments, which were trying to control the South American colonies more closely. In Portugal, Sebastião José de Carvalho Melo, the first Marquis of Pombal, who basically ruled the country from 1750 to 1777, was their main enemy, and united with other European Catholic leaders in 1773 to force Pope Clement XIV to finally just dissolve the Society of Jesus and get rid of the Jesuits. But throughout the 18th century, the power of the Catholic Church continued to decline as it was now mostly controlled by the government and was under constant attack from Enlightenment thinkers. Soon, however, the Enlightenment would turn into a revolution that would cripple the Catholic Church even more than the Reformation ever could. Now, during the early 18th century, the French Empire expanded mainly across the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, whereas the Russians expanded across Siberia. It looked as if the most powerful Catholic and Eastern Orthodox states were going to dominate Europe and the world. But this dream was shattered with the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756. This war broke out after Frederick the Great of Prussia decided to invade his much larger and more powerful neighbor Austria with British support. Now, while the British were pretty effective at whooping Austria's ally France all around the world, the Prussians were about to get destroyed mainly due to Russia. But this would all change in 1762 when Empress Elizabeth of Russia died and was succeeded by her son Peter III, who literally pulled out of the war because he was a fan of his enemy Frederick the Great. And here's Frederick the Great, and here's him fighting during the 7 Years' War. So with Russia out of the war, the Prussians got the break they needed, and they and the British won the war the next year, establishing themselves as the two main Protestant countries in the world. Now, while this changed little in Europe, the British gained a lot, conquering nearly the entire French colonial empire, including Quebec, which unfortunately we as Canadians have been stuck with ever since. However, this also led the English and therefore Protestant settlement in western and southern Ontario, as well as West Florida. However, some of these English settlers got mad that they couldn't steal even more land from the natives after the British set up the Appalachian Mountains as the final frontier, and this alongside the British decisions to let the Catholics worship freely and tax the American colonists led them to begin rebelling. So anyways, this is what Christianity now looked like in 1763 after the end of the 7 Years' War. So we can see again Europe pretty much exactly the same situation, almost nothing has changed. We can see that pretty much now all of Russia has become Orthodox. The Oriental Orthodox and Nestorian churches are kind of the same. There's a bit more of Dutch settlement down here in South Africa, but really the main changes in the Americas. At this point, almost all of South America is Christian, with again some areas that were not yet in the center of the continent and in Patagonia. And we can see that all of Mexico and Central America, as well as the Caribbean, are now Christian. And we can see that the British colonies are definitely predominantly nonconformist, with again the Puritans and their Calvinist descendants still in New England. Of course, the French Catholics are here in Quebec, and parts of the Louisiana Territory, which was just given over to Spain, is also Catholic. So this eventually led to the American Revolution in 1775, in which George Washington and his buddies fought for freedom, while also having slaves and settling more native land in Kentucky and other places. And the Americans did all the work and definitely did not use French, Spanish, and Dutch help during the War of Independence. Surprisingly, not all Americans actually wanted freedom, and many of those who stayed loyal to the British came over to a place called Ontario, where they soon outnumbered the French and then became the main group there. I may only slightly be biased coming from Ontario, but let's keep going. Now, eventually the Americans won their independence in 1783, and in 1791 did something pretty radical, which is that they became the first ever secular country and separated the church from the state. And so now here we have a map of Christianity in 1783. Again, quite similar, but we can see Greenland has now been settled and is now Lutheran. Even more of South America has been settled, and we can see that the Americans have now broken past the Appalachian Mountains and are settling Kentucky, Illinois, and more. The nonconformist Protestants have also become the majority here in Ontario, at least southern Ontario and parts of the Canadian West, but Catholicism is also spreading in the West too. So let's check in on the chat real quick. Okay, well, almost nothing is going on here. So now we get to the French Revolution, of course, the famous storming of the Bastille. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out after France's debt crisis, partly caused by funding the American Revolution, spiraled out of control. And after a failed negotiation, a crowd attacked the Bastille on the 14th of July, a royal fortress with large store of weapons and ammunition. Now, it symbolized the royal regime in France and was torn down, which became symbolic of what would happen in the following decade. Now, King Louis XVI was worried that he would lose control of Paris, so he returned there from his palace in Versailles, where he was accepted as the king of the French people. Now, feudalism was soon abolished, which included church ties and equality before the law was enabled, as well as freedom of worship for the first time. Now, the French Revolution caused a massive shift of power from the Catholic Church to the French state. The church had been the largest landowner in France and controlled a tenth of the land and took a tenth of the money. In August, tithes were abolished, and in November, all church property was confiscated. The church would now pay the clergy, and on the 13th of February 1790, religious orders and monasteries were dissolved. On the 12th of July, the civil constitution of the clergy made the clergy state employees and developed a system for electing priests and bishops. Pope Pius VI and most French Catholics objected to this since it denied his authority over the French church. A quarter of clergy agreed to the new constitution, but the rest refused, and especially in areas such as Normandy, Brittany, and the Vendée, the population turned against the revolution. Now, this is Louis XVI, and although he supported the revolution, he was basically under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, and was urged by his brother and wife to reassert his independence by taking refuge. On the 20th of June 1791, he snuck out, but he was a king, so it didn't take long for him to be recognized after someone looked at him and then looked at the face on their coin. He was then arrested and taken back to Paris, and his attempt to flee the country made many people question his loyalty to France. Now, there was a fear of spies and traitors, and France began preparing for war. Louis was forced to swear allegiance to the new constitution, but he remained suspect. Jacques-Pierre Brissot, the leader of the radical Girondins, prepared a petition demanding Louis' resignation, and a large crowd gathered to sign, but they were soon fired upon. And this is Louis' failed attempt to run away. Now, the crisis over the church did not end, and the decrees were passed to punish priests who refused to accept the constitution. The clergy were given 8 days to comply or else be treated as traitors. In the meantime, both sides prepared for war, with the revolutionaries wanting to spread their values of political liberty and popular rule, while the royalists wanted to use war to regain control of the military and restore their authority. In December 1791, Louis made a speech giving foreign powers a month before he would declare war. And on the 20th of April 1792, the French revolutionaries started when France invaded Austria and Prussia. Now, in order to get support, the government forced all priests to swear an oath of allegiance to the state or be deported. Now, the war was not going well, and the French lost every battle for exactly 5 months until defeating the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy. Now, emboldened by their victory, the National Convention replaced the monarchy with a republic 2 days later and introduced a new revolutionary calendar to replace the Christian calendar, with 1792 becoming year 1. Now, King Louis was then put on trial, and the convention was split exactly half-half on whether he was guilty or innocent. But one guy cast his vote, and that led to the decision to execute him on the 21st of January 1793. Now, you can imagine all the other monarchs in Europe were not exactly happy about this, but it was actually France that decided to declare war on both the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. Now, the revolution soon spiraled into madness as Christianity was replaced with the cult of the Supreme Being, a new religion led by Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre, who started calling himself the Second Messiah. Now, Robespierre, after guillotining thousands of people, ended up under guillotine himself in mid-1794, which ended the so-called Reign of Terror. However, terror hardly ended, as there was a wave of revenge killings against his supporters, Republican officials, and Protestants. Now, in December, the Catholic rebellion finally ended when priests were allowed freedom of religion once again. However, while the worst part of the chaos was over, France was far from peaceful at this time. In 1799, French General Napoleon was sent to invade the Papal States, and there he arrested the 82-year-old Pope Pius VI because he sided against the revolutionaries. And then he forced him to return to France, where Pope Pius died. That year, Napoleon became dictator of France, but 2 years later, he re-established Catholicism as the state religion of France with his concordat with the Pope in 1801. And this is young Napoleon. He may become important in the future, but who knows? Now, what was going on in the Americas? Well, in 1784, Eastern Orthodoxy first spread to the Americas when Russia established its first colony in Alaska. The Protestants soon reached the Pacific when the British colonized Vancouver Island in 1788. They also began their colonization of Australia, and by 1815 began expanding in Tasmania and the area around Sydney. Meanwhile, by 1786, Spain and Portugal had basically colonized almost all of South America, making it the most Catholic continent in the world, and only Patagonia at the very south and Dutch Guiana at the very north remained outside of their control. Meanwhile, in 1803, the U.S. bought Louisiana, which allowed for their settlers to take over the entire Mississippi basin. Now, not to be outdone, in 1811, the British colonized their way westwards across Canada to finally reach the Pacific. And 2 years later, the Russians even set up a colony in California. And so by 1814, we can see Christianity looked quite interesting. Now, again, in Europe, almost nothing has changed. Of course, the Calvinists are still the majority in Scotland, Switzerland, parts of Eastern Hungary and Slovakia, as well as Poland. And they're, of course, remaining there as well in New England and South Africa, and Guyana as well. Meanwhile, the Hussites still holding out in the Czech Republic, of a very small minority. Same with the Nestorians, who are still camping out in the small part of Iraq. The Oriental Orthodox have not changed, again, still in Armenia and Ethiopia primarily. And as for the Anglicans, sort of spread a little more now. Large parts of Wales have become Anglican, but again, still basically just in England and Wales, as well as some parts of northern Canada. The nonconformists, although very few in England, are basically the majority faith all across the Protestant part of the Americas, whether we're talking about Belize, Jamaica, the Bahamas, of course the United States, and Canada. And this is sort of why nonconformist Protestantism, which essentially at this point means evangelicalism, is now associated with Protestantism in large parts of the world. But the original Protestants, the Lutherans, are still going strong all across Scandinavia as well as northern Germany. So let's look at the effects of the revolution on Catholicism in France. Now, Napoleon would eventually be defeated after 7 coalitions were formed against him, and his exile in 1815 would mark the end of the revolutionary period in French history. However, the French Revolution would have long-lasting effects in France and Europe at large. During the height of the revolution, all monasteries were destroyed, 30,000 priests were exiled, and hundreds more were killed. During Napoleon's rule, bishops could still rule their dioceses but could only communicate with the government through the French state, which basically meant that they lost all political power. And so by the time the old Bourbon dynasty was restored, all monasteries were gone and much of their land had been sold. Also, almost no new priests were trained in this time, and many left their jobs, so the number decreased from 60,000 to 25,000 in just 25 years. And that is where I'm going to end the stream today. I hope you enjoyed it. That was essentially about 2 centuries of Christian history, the 17th and 18th centuries, and hopefully we'll do one final stream next time where we will go over the final 2 centuries of Christian history. Of course, if you like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you all for watching. Hopefully I'll see you next time. Thing is, yeah, I know that you guys are trolls, but also you're just helping me with views. So like, I mean, you chose to do this. I don't know. Anyways, folks, I'm heading out. I'm gonna go to my little event.